Thank you, Rebecca. With this, we'll launch our first session here, Institutional Insights on Undergraduate Students. And I wanted to note again, in your programs, we have bios of all our presenters, so please take a look at them. But I will start with just announcing each session and our presenters. So the first one is Multicultural Student Success for Undergraduate Students, Leveraging a Framework and Lessons Learned. And our presenters are Beth Lindgren-Clark, Stephen Hawks, and Shelley Weimer. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Shelley Weimer, and I am the Director of the Office of Measurement Services on the Twin Cities campus.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Lindgren-Clark, and I serve as the Associate Vice Provost for Strategic Enrollment Initiatives in the Office of Undergraduate Education on the Twin Cities campus.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Hawks. I serve as the Director of Undergraduate Assessment in the Office of Undergraduate Education, and then also now being responsible for the administration of the Student Experience in the Research University Survey, which will be sharing some data with you later on this morning.
Oh, you got it?
We didn't catch up first.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to advance on there. There it is. Thank you. So really briefly this morning in our time with you, we would like to provide a couple of different frameworks, workflows for you that we have used over the past year or so in some projects and initiatives on campus. So you can see there, and then at the end, we really want to save time for discussion and conversations around the tables. And so we want to make sure that we have enough time for that. And then at the end of our session, we have a few outcomes here that we really like to instill in those conversation pieces, really being able to use some of this workflow frameworks that we presented to you in your work back within your own offices and programs across the university. And then also just being able, the last one, sharing ideas with others. I think really, having these types of conversations and discussions with your colleagues within your office as well as across the university is really vital and important here. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Beth to start our presentation.
I think it's important to provide a little bit of context to how we got to this work and how we led to this framework. And I'd love to say that we had this framework laid out in front of us and we followed it all the way through the process. But as you'll discover while we present, that's not the case. So we did have some lessons learned that we're really going to be excited to share. But one of my responsibilities in my role is to oversee the enrollment plan. And the enrollment plan has 10 high-level priorities for the university. And so I convene a number of groups to try to keep these priorities and efforts moving forward. So on your tables, you'll see, I printed out, I'm a visual person, the workflow of the Strategic Enrollment Management Framework, if you would like to reference it. I would like to first say, two things. I forgot my colleagues in the International Student and Scholar Services Office. They are a member of this high-level committee, so I have an electronic copy that has the updated version. And before I delve into this, I also wanted to make one little plug as well. Orientation and Transition Experiences today at noon is having a first-gen photo on Northrop Plaza. So if you have any students you know and you want to send them a quick email, they're really going to honor and celebrate our first-gen students today at noon. So I wanted to add that to the invitation. So in the committee, our goal is to really understand those high-level priorities. We have a summer meeting every summer with the provost and president on the Twin Cities campus to really identify those priorities and where we can do the work. And so you can see on the our charges there and who's kind of engaged in the process at a high level. And then we have 4 standing committees. So I'm going to highlight 2 of those standing committees, but the other 2, one is called a College Unit Student Success Committee, in which we really try to connect the work amongst what's happening all across campus. So there's a lot of collegiate folks, there's Office for Student Affairs, Housing and Residential Life, and we give updates, and oftentimes they're doing a lot of amazing things in their units to support a lot of these efforts, and we just want to connect that work. The other committee that I'll mention is called a Curriculum Committee. And when we see something happening in the curriculum that's impacting student success, we really, that committee takes that on. So for example, they just did a gateway course analysis, which I know Peter Radcliffe is going to delve into a little bit this morning. But the two committees that are more relevant to this framework that we're talking about this morning, one is the data committee. So this is a group of folks, you can see the representatives listed there, from various aspects of campus who all have their hands in data. And so our goal is to bring these folks together, and when we're identifying those different institutional priorities, think about what data we already have, because believe it or not, we have a lot of data as an institution. And so it's just a matter of bringing all of that together in a meaningful way so that we can leverage that information. And of course, as Shelley will talk about, there are gaps in the data, and then it allows us to go further into those areas of gaps. But that really informs the overall work of the Strategic Enrollment Management Committee, and there's a member from the Data Committee who serves on every standing committee so that we can inform the work of each standing committee. Another standing committee that we have that is really critical to the student success mission is the Multicultural Student Success Committee. And this is really about improving our students' experience, retention, and graduation on the Twin Cities campus. And so this committee, in its first iteration, took on this form of some subcommittees with committee members representing. But you'll see in our process that this committee came out with some recommendations, and now we're sort of moving on into a different iteration of how the committee is doing the work. And that's at a high level right now with equity and diversity, student affairs, and undergraduate education, trying to determine how we want to implement the said recommendations. And then that in turn can move off into the next phase of the committee. But this committee, when they first met, there was a lot of questions about the data. There was a lot of questions trusting the data. What is the data saying? Is that really true? Kind of, are there systems in place that are giving us this data? So we created some guiding questions to sort of drive this work. And this again is about the student experience. And when Shelley introduces our case study, if you will, you'll see that the diversity resolution is really driving a lot of this work. So you can see here that we have a lot of things around belonging. We have a lot of things here around classroom experiences. How does the university express its values relating to diversity, equity, inclusion? A lot of things that we were trying to help guide the conversation to lead and drive us towards the recommendations. Now, when we define student success, we can define it in these types of words: retention, graduation, satisfaction, learning outcomes, development outcomes, but we can also define it in these types of ways for students: academically focused, career, student engagement, which I will also, well-being, financial success, and also sense of belonging, which is a really critical component for this. To give you a sense of some of the other areas that we might be working on in strategic enrollment areas, these are some of the high-level topics. Transfer student experiences, which has a lot of intersectionality with our multicultural student success, retention efforts, academic alerts, that enters more into the faculty realm, of course, improving campus climate, which we're kind of focusing here on today. So that's just a brief high-level overview. And as I mentioned, I would have loved to have said we had all the data collected and ready to go, and then we followed this framework. But I'm going to let Shelley kind of introduce you to this framework that we realized we were following, and have her take you through those steps.
So I'll start by describing a little bit my role in this project. The Office of Measurement Services was part of the data committee, and it was really an intentional effort to get all the other surveys that we're doing besides the big SERUs there, because we do have a lot of other data that's out there that doesn't get shared with this broader community. So we started there, and then I served on the committee as that liaison to try to get data from the data committee into the hands of the Multicultural Student Success Committee, and that really grew into another small group to collect, analyze, and get that data into the right hands. And Lynette Werner, who's not here anymore, really helped facilitate that effort and set in with all these subcommittees to make sure that the data was getting to them as quickly as we could. So I'm going to talk about this framework. This is the framework that, as Beth mentioned, we realized we've kind of followed. And I'm hoping that something like this can help you think about how you incorporate data into making recommendations. As we talk through this, there's some common themes that are starting to come out of similar initiatives and similar issues we're trying to tackle, like student mental health and preventing sexual misconduct. There are a lot of different things, but everything kind of happens out of order. And I'll talk about that a little bit more too. But we will have a chance to apply this a little bit later on in our discussions. So keep that in mind as we walk this through. So our case study, we're going to use the Multicultural Student Success Committee as our case study. And that top part of that framework really starts with some priority. Okay, so that could be, for us, it was the Board of Regents resolution. For you, it could be somebody in your department, a department chair, department head, a provost. It could be you and your work and what's in your sphere of influence. But there's something that's saying this is what we're trying to do and here are our goals. For the Multicultural Student Success Committee, that was really regarding the improving satisfaction for students of color, including campus climate, and reducing that graduation gap. So we have until 2025 to do that, but we need to make sure that we're making efforts towards that, and that's really the charge and what this committee is trying to make an impact towards those goals. From there needs to be some responsibility or accountability, or someone needs to be charged with trying to meet those goals. And that's really what this committee was brought together to do. As Beth mentioned, there's a variety of subcommittees and people from all over the institution that were brought in to bring in their experience and their expertise. This is an institutional system-wide issue, and there was representation from a lot of different places to tackle something this big. And I think that's important to have the right people at the table. So in that first phase, we really want to look at what information we have, what information we don't have, and in very simplest terms, it's, well, what do we know, what don't we know, and what are we already doing about this? And this is really where we started to kind of say, okay, data committee, what information do we know about multicultural students? What information do we know about this? How are we going to link this to our goals? How are we going to answer all those guiding questions? We really started to make this a collaborative and iterative effort between the data committee and the Multicultural Success Committee, because as they were having conversations in their subcommittees, they'd come back and say, is there any data to support this? Do we know anything about this? Are we already doing something in these areas? And those were all questions that we were trying to answer. In turn, a lot of the subcommittees were collecting their own data. They had experiences and expertise that cannot be replaced with data. And they had positions where they were able to connect with students to collect some of those stories and learn more qualitatively about what students were experiencing. So they did a lot of work to collect it as well. It was not just the data committee. We were kind of all pulling together from a lot of different places. So what we do know, I mentioned the experience of the people in the room, but I can't emphasize that enough. We can have our 200, we started with 242 slides, thank you, Peter, and lots of other people, where, I think it was one of the very first meetings. It was like, here's everything we can find that we think might be useful. It was a lot of information, but that is not as meaningful without the people that are living this every day. And I really think that that's important. So after our 242 slide deck, which we didn't have the guiding questions at the time, it was institutionally, we were pulling together as much as we possibly could to inform the effort. We went back and we had those guiding questions. Our team at OMS pulled together a lot of over 1,200 just in the surveys we had access to. A survey inventory, we mapped all of the questions that our partners in housing and residential life, Boynton, we had, obviously Saru was in there, but a lot of programmatic surveys that were all trying to ask questions of their students because they were trying to address this problem. They're trying to learn what they can do to help their students. So we pulled those together, we mapped those items back to those guiding questions. And so when we were trying to answer the guiding questions, we could go back and say, what other data points do we have? So we were constantly gathering information. But there was still things we didn't know. Probably the biggest one is, what are we doing in this space? And we're doing the same thing with mental health now. What efforts already exist to help students in these areas, and what's working? So the subcommittee, I think it's the institutional barriers, institutional structures and barriers, which was a fabulous, fabulous working group. They created an inventory to collect all the information on all the different programs and services that were geared towards students of color, Indigenous people, and all other groups. So they did a really good job of doing that. And again, we kind of get back into this triangulation of data where we have a lot of survey data, we have a lot of institutional organizational data, and we have a lot of experience in the room. Is that all telling the story? Like, where is the voice of the student in all this? And I think sometimes we forget about those stories and we have a hard time quantifying them. So we wanted to make sure to bring that in and that they were represented in the conversation. So we went back and did a lot of different comment coding for all those thousands and thousands of survey questions or responses that students give us all their time to answer. We coded a lot of those to find themes. The committees held listening sessions, I think 11 listening sessions with over 90 students of color across the institution, with people that they were familiar with, to have open and honest conversations, to get the nuances of what they were experiencing. And all those data combined could really confirm what we were learning and what we were needing, and a lot of the things that Steve's going to talk about later on. So what were we doing? I mentioned creating the inventory. It was really a good idea to see what we are already providing and where the gaps are. There's 85 different programs were identified as a part of this effort, with 75 different student groups in 2018 and 2019. But there were gaps. A lot was happening in the first year, and then not as many programs or intentional efforts were happening later on students get along their journey. Transfer students were also having less offerings. So we're starting to see what we're doing, where we're missing, where we're kind of falling off. The analysis and synthesis. So I mentioned you're not going to give everybody 1,200 survey items and 242 slides and a listening session summary of 11 different groups and 200,000 comments. So it really was about making sure that we are answering questions when people need them. This is why it was iterative. If they needed something, we would give it to them before everything was synthesized. It was a big effort, but we were always working towards answering those guiding questions so that when they went to make the recommendations, they could pull that knowledge and have that support or refute the recommendations they were making. So prioritization is really key. What information would be helpful first? Definitely thinking about who's going to be using the data, what format would be helpful. We ended up sticking with, and there's links in here that you guys will have access to the actual final report from the data committee. But we organized and pulled data into the framework organized by the guiding questions. And that was really helpful, as I'll maybe not say it because I'll say it now, in the lessons learned, is that if you have that framework, you can divide up the work and have people plug in things to that framework in a way that you know is going to be useful to the stakeholders who are getting that data. Call for reinforcements. I say that jokingly, but it was a team effort, definitely. Having multiple people actually do the work, do the analysis in the areas that they're familiar with the data they're familiar with, and plug it in was really imperative, and collaboration is key. So sharing and using the data, again, I think it would be great. Everything not everything, but a lot of what we've been able to synthesize and boil down is in this report. I will not go through everything, but please take a look at that. It has a lot of information, and Steve will highlight some of the key elements. Recommendations and implementation. Beth talked a little bit about this, but each subcommittee, based off the data they have, and sometimes they were making recommendations and we were going back and looking for data all at the same time, but they put forth those intervention plans. We reviewed them as a committee, vetted and prioritized. And again, data helps you prioritize this if there's data that's still supporting those efforts that you're putting forth. And we'll eventually implement the recommendations or alternate solutions, and then monitoring the data over time, especially the data and the goals that were established as a part of the resolution in this example. So the lessons work. This is not a linear process. This will be a circle at some point when I have more time. And there will be insertion points at any point. You've already collected data. A lot of the reason the data is there is because you know it's a problem before it's a Board of Regents charge. There's information going, we're analyzing and giving things, and that's just gonna be okay, and you've gotta be comfortable with it because it's not gonna be perfect. But it can be overwhelming, so start small. Just start with the data that you have, break it into small components, identify what you don't have so you can start to collect it early on. So hopefully those two things meet. You have kind of a completed picture as you can get when you need to make when you need to get to a recommendation. There's a lot of data, but we acknowledge there's still gaps sometimes because we're not always thinking about all the data we need institutionally. So there's going to be things that are missing when we're doing it piecemeal. Build time in to evaluate the what are you doing. There's plenty of successful programs out there that could be scaled. There could be gaps, but look at the inventory of what you're doing. And I think the overall theme is that we can support the recommendations with the data, and we couldn't do that with without the people that live it every day and connecting those people with the data. So with that, I'll let Beth take back over.
I just wanted to reiterate what Shelley said is this was very much a collaboration and at some point did get very overwhelming because of the many data points that we have. So guiding questions are really critical in that process. And then just knowing that there's still work to do because we didn't get through everything that we wanted to get through. And without Lynette Werner, whose time was allocated to this would have been much more difficult to accomplish. And I think sometimes as an institution, we don't put forward new resources to this space. We put this on the backs of folks who are already doing lots of other work and take the time and are invested in this to roll up our sleeves and dig into it further to make meaning. And so those are just really some interesting facts. I want to quickly I'm not going to spend time on these recommendations, but I thought maybe you'd be curious as to what they were. So recommendation one, I'm going to introduce the recommendation, and then Steve's going to share some of the data that we had supporting each recommendation. The first recommendation was really about examining those institutional structures and effectiveness, which Rebecca was really referring to in some of her opening remarks. And this is really about doing some kind of strategy to conduct an equity-minded student success review, potentially with external evaluators who would come into the institution. And there are lots of tools out there like diversity scorecard tools that can be leveraged that can help the institution tell its story from an external voice and maybe give us new eyes on some of the things that we're doing. So that's recommendation one.
And so a couple of the questions from the listening sessions that was conducted through OMS, what are the top support services, programs, or offices critical to success as reported by students of color? And so, these are coming from the students themselves. And so they're telling us what is working, and then also what may not be working as best for them. And so several students of color noted that they feel programs related to their needs are underfunded. Indicating that the university does not value diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, we have the positive side and also the not so positive side. And then also I won't read all of these off for you since we are running short of time and we want to make sure we have enough time for the conversation piece. But you can see students of color were significantly less likely than white students on a couple of things there. And then those are coming from the SARU survey, which I'll go into a little bit more detail here after the next recommendation. And so hopefully we'll start to see a little pattern here that we'll take into that next stage where we start to have some more additional in-depth conversations at our tables.
Another recommendation was around improving classroom climate, which really aligns well with the conversation here today, but really wanting to convene a committee of distinguished faculty along with our folks from Center for Education and Innovation to address teaching practices and support positive classroom climate and recommendations to sustain inclusive practices with that accountability. And so this is really, this is a really more of a difficult recommendation, but we thought it was very important because there was a lot of student voice around their classroom experiences.
I'll put this lengthy quote up here for you to read. but just by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the student experience in the Research University Survey? The SARU survey is what we call it. So most people. So just to give a little bit of an overview, a background of the survey really quickly, and this is only applicable to the Twin Cities campus. And so the system campuses participate in another survey, the NSSE survey, the National Survey of Student Engagement. And so there's similar questions between the two surveys, but on the Twin Cities, we administer SARU. And this is given on and off since 2009 to all of our undergraduate students when we do administer it. And so again, you can see a quote there, and then also just to show you some data points. So this question, overall, I feel comfortable with the climate for diversity and inclusion in my classes. And so specifically talking about the classroom climate experience, you can see 66% of all undergraduate students agree or strongly agree with that statement. But once you start to parse it out and look at individual students or by student groups, you can see there's a wide differences there. So we can see for African American students, only 34% of undergraduate students agree with that statement. Again, students identifying as not male, not female, 20% there. The white students is the highest point there at almost 71%. And then again, once we actually start to look at the different race ethnicity categories of our students, we can start to parse out some differences between them to really, share this information out to those applicable groups of, here's what the data is telling us. And so again, applying that framework, how can we act upon this data? And then again, just some more questions here. The gold is all undergraduate students, and then you can see students of color, international, and then comparisons to the white students as well. And then again, touching on the classroom climate experience for our students, white students are significantly more likely than Asian, international, and African American students to indicate they frequently experience students being treated equitably and fairly within the classroom, opportunities for active participation in classes, and then faculty maintaining respectful interactions in class. And so really alluding to some of the earlier conversations by Rebecca and Virajita, how can we get this information to the faculty, and how can we work with them to kind of try to improve the classroom experience for our students. And then another data slide here, again. And then sometimes, the really telling story is the quotes from students themselves. And so again, I'll leave this up here for you to take a look at and read while we go on to the next action step.
But the first line there, faculty members do not represent me or look like me. And the percentages that you shared at the beginning of your remarks, Rebecca, that's astounding. And I think we have a lot of work to do in this space, as you alluded to.
And I believe, Virajita, all the slides will be shared. Yes. Okay. I can't see you, but yep, okay.
We had 4 recommendations, but we're sharing 3 today. The fourth one was one of the, I don't know what the order is, but one of them was really around student finances. And so that was very specific to our recommendations, but we're sharing the 3 that are a lot more broad and global that could be more relative to a lot of your work. So the final one that we were highlighting here is really about increasing direct support and programs for multicultural and underrepresented students. And if you go back to the list from the inventory of all the places that students find that support, some of those are very specific programs provided for students from underrepresented backgrounds. And so I think as an institution, we need to continue to look for ways, but also find ways that we can remove barriers as an institution and in our systems, which will support and lift up all students. So there were a couple of recommendations that came specifically out of here. One is around success coaching to be able to provide a holistic and individualized support for students. And this happens in lots of different pockets. This can happen in President's Emerging Scholars on the Twin Cities campus. This can happen in Multicultural Center for Academic Excellence, but we were thinking more of a cohesive approach to that instead of sort of piecemeal in different parts of the campus. Developing specific programming that's really aimed at populations of Indigenous men and men of color and expanding where the data indicates. I think we try to do a little bit of this with things like the Huntley House, but I think we could do a lot more as this continues. Men of color success is a trend across the country, and we're not unique in that situation, but I think that we can do a lot more as a campus. And then again, as we alluded to, investing in those programs beyond the first year. Our first year students of color retention is actually higher than the cohort and has been the last 2 out of 3 years. So we do a lot of support as they're entering in, but how does that support continue beyond? And then where are the gaps in that support for transfer students? So this is what I just alluded to here in terms of the first year retention. We want to go into the Proaction Cafe, but we thought for a minute we'd see if there was any, yes, go ahead, Rajita. Perfect. Online participants, if you have any questions, now would be a great time to submit those.
I will need to switch here.
Okay, great. So we'll take just a couple minutes to see if anyone has any questions before we have you kind of delve into the work at your tables.
Do you have what you need to bring in the I'm going to have to invite the online participants to unmute as well as switch your video on if you'd like to participate in the Q&A.
Lovely and impressive work, and I'm really grateful that you're doing the deep dive into this and leading the way. Who gets the results of your report? Because I think that's really, the work is important, but also the dissemination is important. So who currently gets these results?
Sure. So through the strategic enrollment framework, the recommendations did come back to that priority group, and then that moved on to the vice presidents and provosts in the areas of student affairs, Office of Equity and Diversity, and undergraduate education. And so I know Leanne Moline was the one who led this work in partnership with Sean Garrick when he was here. And so now they're taking that to a high level. There's been some transition at the high level in equity and diversity. And so bringing all of our partners together, because this is an institutional thing that we need to work through. So right now where they are with that phase is that they're determining what are the next steps for the recommendations. Are those the correct recommendations? And all there are alternatives that they wish that we would explore. And the question was, would they consider giving these reports to the schools and colleges? I believe so. I think there's a lot more work that can be done in terms of doing that deeper dive into specific college and unit data. I think the caution there, though, sometimes the numbers can become much smaller, and so it's hard to make those correlations and relationships when your numbers become smaller. So we did not do that in our work, but I think there's more work to be done in that space.
Oh, thanks, Beth. I'm Chris. I'm from the Center for Educational Innovation, Chris Gorman. And I had the same question as Teddy, but also I wanted to ask, this is institutional data is kind of one thing. And I think as we move towards recommendations, there's a second piece, which is a lot of campuses are experiencing a lot of these trends, and some are engaged in initiatives which reduce these gaps, change the structures. And I'm wondering at what point in your process and in this, do we consult not just the internal data of what people are saying they need, which will typically probably be based on what services have been successful here and what we provide within our structure. But I'm wondering at what point in the process do we examine what other possibilities might be available from other places, or what we can learn from the literature or experiences of those who have perhaps different constraints on their change process?
So that was definitely part of the subcommittee's process that they were bringing to the table. So not only were they inventorying what was actually happening, but as they were making their recommendations, they weren't just looking at filling the gaps in the programs or expanding the programs we have, but they were doing a lot of external review for what has been successful at other institutions, what other institutions have been doing, what they've been recommending, what the lit reviews were saying. So they did it. We had speakers come in and talk to us and give recommendations. So there was a lot of external consideration given to the recommendations that the committees were bringing. And then we were using our data to kind of support those recommendations and kind of vet them. But that was definitely part of the process. It just lived within the recommendations component, which really isn't outlined in the framework. I do want to say with the framework that's important to note is it's really a snapshot of how we think about bringing data to that conversation, but it's not a framework about how this committee actually functioned. It was a lot more complicated than this. There was a lot more moving parts within the committees about how they work together, how they reach their recommendations. So it's not meant to necessarily be all encompassing of the work that happened for the Multicultural Student Success Committee.
I would also add, yeah, that I would say that we probably could have done a lot more in this space. I feel like there's a lot of initiatives in this space. So for example, the APLNU has a subgroup that's meeting, and we're a part of that as the Twin Cities campus, and they're trying to create action strategies, and they meet with universities in the APLNU organization and to try to identify what's working well, what's not working well, to share some of those best practice pieces. But I certainly think that that's something we could do a little bit more of. I think also that's where some of the external review recommendation came into play, so that we could leverage tools like diversity, equity scorecards, which would bring to light maybe things that we're not even thinking about as an institution. And or sometimes I do external reviews, and sometimes as an external reviewer it's easier to say, and sometimes has a stronger voice as an external reviewer. And you can also provide examples of other institutions who have had success in these spaces and try to emulate that practice. Great point.
We do have an online question as well, if I could just read it off quick. Has the university considered replicating national efforts that have been successful in supporting and retaining a more diverse group of students? For example, becoming a Posse Foundation partner, applying for the HHMI Driving Change Project?
I don't know. I would hope that, I mean, I think the thing that I get cautious about is, and there's a great book called Are We a Student Ready Campus? And I get cautious about one-off interventions versus examining our institutional structures and processes. Because I think we should spend more, it's easier maybe to do a one-off intervention, and it's much harder to examine the institutional structures and processes. But to answer your question, I'm sure there's lots of grants we could find out there that would support this work. And I'm not sure beyond the things like the American Talent Initiative and the APLNU campus climate efforts, if we've gone into those other spaces. If Leanne Moline were here, she might be able to answer that more readily.
There is one more online question, and then Patricia, I'll get to you. I'm interested in exploring ways to better connect more people to this data through creative means. Have you seen any good examples of more informal methods for spreading information?
Well, I think when I, for example, do first year retention studies, and I have done that for 6 years, I create these infographics called Levers infographics, and I share it wherever I can. Or when students fill out a Tell Us About Yourself survey before coming to orientation, we create infographics and we share that wherever we can. Stakeholders, advisors, student leaders who are leading students, and we try to have conversations about what that means and how that can inform their role of interacting with students. So I think sometimes we think that has to be a really big, heavy lift, and I think sometimes there's just very simple ways to bring people into the conversation around any data that you might be collecting. I'm sure Shelley has some examples too around how people share data within their units, but yes.
You shared with us comments the students made regarding faculty. I'm just curious, do students make comments regarding the staff? I mean, their counselors, their advisors, individuals that they have contact with on a regular basis, or not regular, but yeah, regular basis. Thank
Yep,
you.
it is an open-ended question, and so we do get those. This was mainly focused on just the faculty. But yes, we do have those, and then we share them out. We identify which student the college is enrolled in, and then we share that with that particular college. Yeah, so we can definitely do that.
Thank you as well. I think that's another thing to note is that they also make comments about peers themselves. You know, so it's not just the faculty interactions in the classroom, but it's also the student to student interaction that happens within a classroom. So a lot of that came out in the open-ended comments and the listening sessions as well.
My last comment, the question put diversity and inclusion together. Has the CERU considered splitting it? You know, do you feel you're in a diverse environment, and then are you included? Because they are different. Yep. So
I would say the institutional research is not here. So the CERU is governed by a consortium board. And I know the undergraduate survey, it's supposed to go up for review over the next 3 years. And so I think that's definitely a comment that I can take back to our representative. And, you know, we'll see where it goes over the next couple of years. So that is a very good question. Thank you.
Well, we want to stay on time and give you a little bit of opportunity at your tables. Oops, I can't do that. I have to go on to the, okay. So I wanted to take a minute to just introduce the Proaction Cafe. We did put some flip chart paper at your table, and on page 11 of your booklet, there are the questions that we were encouraging you to think about from your own sphere of influence. And we recognize that whether you're here on a system campus, whether you're in the graduate school or in undergraduate education, whatever your role is, you do have a sphere of influence. And we wanted you to think about, maybe it's institutional structures or effectiveness, maybe it's about classroom climate, or maybe it's something that's more student facing and student support. And go through the framework, if you will. So what would be that charge? What's the priority? What's the charge? What do you know about the data? What don't you know? What are you currently using? And what our goal would be to have you work through one of those examples, maybe at your table with the colleagues at your table on the flip chart paper. It's really for you to engage and have a conversation. The thing that's maybe missing from page 11 that Shelley has alluded to more than once is the guiding questions are really critical. Why are you doing the work? I mean, in our example, we had a charge from the Board of Regents. I think we didn't need a charge to know that we needed to do this work, but I think the charge elevated the work, which I was really grateful for. And so what is that charge that you have? What are those guiding questions? Why is this important to you or your unit or to your division? So we wanted to take a few minutes to have you do that at your table and go in conversation with one another about your reactions to this framework and this space.
I'm going to add.
Yep.
Just to add to what Beth just introduced, for our online participants, we have your program document on page 11 will show you the questions, but our tech team is putting you into breakout rooms of about 10 people each. And so please unmute and share your video so that you can actually interact there. And we'd love to have you report out at the end. And we're going to take this whole session will last till 9:45, but we'll leave the last 5 minutes for a report out. So any questions? We would like to capture some things at your table on the flip chart paper and Post-its provided, because we're going to actually document this and provide it for our institutional partners and also back to you. So, sorry, I know the conversations are going well, but I think we are running out of time. So I'm welcoming everyone to kind of reconnect here also for our online participants. I think your breakout sessions will now end, but feel free to have someone from your breakout sessions share out. We'll start with the room here and then go on to you online. So who would like to share what came up at your tables?
Whoever first taker.
I saw a lot of note-taking at the tables. I think the table nearest you is ready, I think.
Well, there is some online activity if.
Okay, Deborah, you want to start online?
No, disregard. My bad.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, you can join in too. I feel like we didn't necessarily follow the exercise exactly, but had some good conversation. So we focused on direct support and programs for students. And we talked a little bit about representation and how that matters, making sure that students, once they're here, feel supported. We talked a little bit about all the resources on campus and how there's so much, but it can be kind of overwhelming for students if you just blast a bunch of things at them. So maybe the need for more individualization or coaching with particular students, or all students really, just to connect the dots a little bit more. What else did we talk about? Yeah, having faculty and staff of color, just to include that representation and making sure that those opinions and voices are heard. I think students oftentimes, with the retention, students may leave because they don't feel like they belong. I shared that I noticed that Oregon CSE and a lot of females do that too. Like, I don't think I'm here. Like, people make me do like the crap work in the labs because I'm a female. So figuring out how you can foster that belonging, I think, is important. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Another
Thank you.
table?
Thank you for bearing with us. I had to summarize. So just kind of reiterating the need for more avenues for personal support and on top of professional support, because students tend to perceive a lack of resources that may or may not be able to communicate it to them. So just thinking about how do we form personal relationships that kind of help us understand students more. And also recognizing that there's a lot of departments on campus that are collecting information, but it happens in silos. And so kind of thinking about that feedback and how we can better communicate this information. That's it.
Thank you very much. Was there anything online?
No. Not yet.
Oh, there's a.
We have time for one more table.
Yes.
One of the things we talked about was in terms of structural effectiveness is hiring practices, and how do we diversify our hiring practices, not just in terms of, the qualifications listed or putting, searching for diverse candidates, but how do we reframe what is a quality candidate, and what kind of language are we using that encourages some folks to apply for positions more than others? And then, to me, the biggest challenge there is reframing what a quality candidate means based on historically a certain set of like preferred qualifications. And that's the hardest thing for me to get my mind around. So does anyone else have anything to add?
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. But I wanted to, one thing I wanted to share about the Twin Cities campus and sort of to the comments around individualization of services and support is we're leveraging A+, which is our, everybody knows what A+ is, our 360 tool where academic advisors can really manage their caseloads. We're using that a lot more in a lot of other ways to support student success. But one that launched at the end of September was called the Referral for Service. And so we actually have departments who can receive referrals. After talking with a student, an advisor can make a referral to a department, and the department will actually reach out to the student, which we didn't have that mechanism in place before, which tries to individualize that support a little bit. But we hope to continue to grow in a lot of those spaces. We did have a link to the 242 slides that we started out within this process. So feel free. We just were talking about our strategy for dissemination of these reports and this data so that it could be a little bit more visible to folks who are doing the work and just want to know where the data lives. And then also there's a link to the report, and we would welcome any of your emails or questions anytime if you have any ideas or thoughts about this work. So thank you very much.
The slides will be posted on the Diversity Data Deep Dive website, which is part of the dcop.umn.edu website. And the link was it's embedded in the presentation.